Hello, this is Tim Congdon, Chair of the Institute of International Monetary Research at the University of Buckingham. It's the start of 2024, in fact right in the middle of January, and as everyone knows, 2024 is the year of the American presidential election. In these videos towards the end of last year, I concentrated on the American public debt scene because there seemed to me to be a huge area of potential trouble and discussion in the next few years. And there's a sense in which 2024 will be make or break year for American public finances. Of course, just 1 year by itself may not matter that much, but what happens in the next presidential term is fundamental to the outlook for the American public finances and then to the sustainability of those finances further out into the next, say, 10, 20 years. What I want to do today is to look at the American situation in a wider international context and then to draw some implications about what the next president will have to do. My first chart is of the ratio of public debt to gross domestic product national output for the leading G7 economies going back about 30 years. I don't include here China, India, and so on, but at the start of this period, certainly these economies dominated the world economy. They're still very, very important. Now you can see at the top, there's Japan, with the ratio of public debt to GDP about 200%. I'm not going to talk about that very much. Then you can see at the start of this period, there's Italy in second place. It's still, I think, more or less at second place at the moment. But actually, you can see the USA coming up fast. And I think what one has to say here is that obviously much of this 30-year period, Italy has been a byword for fiscal incompetence, for incontinence, for its problems in keeping public debt under control. Well, I'm afraid the USA may exceed Italy in its ratio of public debt to GDP in the next few years, indeed even the next presidential term. This is obviously a worry for everyone, and let me now just try and see where we're going in the next few years with this chart. This is the chart showing it's from the International Monetary Fund, the data from the IMF. You can see it's a structural deficit relative to GDP. That's the underlying deficit where you take out the effects of the business cycle. If you have a recession, that reduces tax revenues, increases certain types of public spending, so the deficit widens. If you have a boom, that increases tax revenues and also enables some, say, welfare spending to go down, so that reduces the deficit relative to GDP, sometimes creates a surplus indeed. So this is the underlying structural deficit relative to GDP. I've taken 2023 as the starting point. These figures are relatively definite now. And you can see that the USA has a deficit for getting on for 9% of GDP, larger than Japan, larger than any other of the G7 nations. Now there's a bit of a surprise here, of course, in that you see Italy is not actually way out in the big spenders, as it were. Its deficit's about 2 or 3% of GDP. So this is one of the reasons for expecting the USA to go ahead of Italy in the next few years, and obviously this is something that needs to be noticed. Okay, well, to assess the future in this area of American public policy, we need to think about the past to some extent. So what we've got here is a chart of the American structural deficit, again, going back some years. You can see how the deficit soared at the time of the Great Recession. That's tied up with the cyclicality of the public finances. And then under President Obama, there was a large reduction in the structural deficit, about 5% or so of GDP, between 2010 and 2015. When Trump became president at the start of 2017, the underlying deficit was 2 or 3% of GDP, not balanced, but certainly sustainable more or less, and the ratio of debt to GDP was stable for some years. Now, the deterioration, therefore, to the current 9% of GDP has occurred since then. Of course, there was the effect of COVID. COVID, of course, reduced tax revenues, the burst of public spending, the stimulus checks and so on to deal with it. And that led to this surge in public debt relative to GDP. The deterioration ought now to have disappeared on the structural deficit. COVID's over, and it's quite important that America has sustainable public finances. But let's then look at the numbers, the specific numbers for the ratio of the structural deficit to GDP between the end of Obama and the end of the Biden presidency towards the end of this year, early 2025. This shows you, what I've done here is to kind of wipe out the effect of COVID in the middle. I've just assumed that those large deficits, about 5% of GDP each, was kind of COVID spending. And my conclusion is that the rise in the structural deficit from around about 2.5%, 3% of GDP up to the current getting on for 9% of GDP has occurred under both Trump and Biden, and about equally. So they are equally to blame for the deterioration in the USA's public finances in this period. Plague on both your houses, you might say, since it's currently assumed, just the middle of January, that they will be the presidential candidates for the two main parties. And in a way, what I've just said isn't very encouraging. Obviously, this is what's happened under the two presidents that really matter in this context, and it isn't very good. What I want to do now is just to make some conjectures about the American public debate on this subject this year, and indeed for the next few years. Because what happens in terms of the policy does depend upon what the key opinion formers, the key opinion influencers, what they think and what they believe. Now, if we go back to the start of the 30-year period I've just been talking about, the US public debt was about 60% of GDP. Sure, it was much more expensive to serve because interest rates were higher. In fact, the debt interest to GDP was about 5%, much higher than at present. But President Clinton made a big theme in 1992, a big theme of his election campaign, was that the debt was out of control. That was when the debt was 60% of GDP. It's now 120% of GDP. And do we see the same prominence of that issue in the kind of things we hear from Trump and Biden? I'm afraid we don't. All through this period, but particularly in the last 10, 20 years, the influence of Keynesians on the American economic debate has been increasing. Their tradition has been to favor high budget deficits, high public spending, to so-called stimulate the economy. As you'll gather from where I'm talking, I'm very skeptical about that. But so when Obama, apparently on the advice of Larry Summers, in 2011, 2012, decided that tax increases had to take place to reduce the budget deficit, there are lots of worries about a so-called fiscal cliff, about the narrowing of the deficit that would lead to a recession or a downturn in the American economy. These fears were completely groundless. The American economy grew at an above-trend rate in the early 2010s. One of my worries about the prospects for US public debt in the next 2 years is that this kind of Keynesian hegemony, this sort of constant harping on about the possible supposed deflationary risks of so-called fiscal contraction, will again be a theme. And this will be one thing, one feature of the debate, which will prevent the necessary action to reduce the deficit. I think it's worth saying here also that one might like to think of the USA as having very strong public institutions, as having understood traditions of fiscal solvency, of the need to keep the deficit under control, to aim at least for a balanced budget. Well, I wonder, let's just be clear that in Congress there have been brinkmanship about raising the debt ceiling. It's been an opportunity for political theatre between the two main parties. And there's been worries that the debt ceiling won't be raised, that the government will be unable to pay its bills, this kind of thing. Hardly very reassuring in the larger picture. One has to say here that there's nothing certain about the USA returning to fiscal sanity, in my view. The laws of arithmetic, the laws of economics are just the same in North America as they are in South America. And if these deficits keep on piling up and the debt keeps on increasing, there'll be a need to pay higher interest rates to bondholders, and that will make the future deficits wider. If the debt keeps on rising relative to GDP, and if the interest rate on that debt keeps on rising because of investor uncertainty about whether they're going to get their money back, then this obviously is a very worrying situation for the USA and indeed the wider world. So I want, just before I conclude on all this, to say that let me concede to those who want to be optimistic about this situation that yes, modern democracies, despite the pressures, despite the demands from voters, despite the risks of populism at elections, they have kept deficits down over medium-term programs of fiscal consolidation. Even Italy still has a very serious public debt problem, but it has reduced its deficit. If you go back to the start of the 1990s, Canada also had a big problem with its public debt. It hasn't reduced the ratio of debt to GDP very much, but it has now got a low deficit relative to GDP. Its public finances are in relatively good shape, certainly better shape than most of the G7. So these things aren't inevitable. And as I said, Obama also reduced the deficit relative to GDP, and that's in the relatively recent past. The worry here, I think, has to be the extreme polarization of American politics at the moment. And although I'm sure you don't want to hear what my political views are, it seems to me frightening that tens of millions of people are prepared to vote for someone who courts of law may decide later this year is a criminal. And it's very disappointing, frankly, that we haven't got, in the coming presidential election, two candidates who care about the long-run solvency of the American government and the American whole system of law, order, and so on. This is something that has to worry everyone in the world, not just in the United States. Thank you.